The very first country to openly declare itself a communist state was the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Later becoming the core of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR in 1922, while socialist movements, theories, and uprisings had appeared for decades prior. It was the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Revolution of 1917 that created the first government claiming Marxist principles as the ideological foundation of its political system. This transformation would shape global politics for the entire 20th century and set a model, though often imperfectly followed, for future communist governments. Before 1917, Russia was an empire ruled by the Romanov dynasty. It was a highly stratified society with immense inequality, especially between the wealthy elites and the masses of peasants and industrial laborers. The pressures of rapid industrialization, combined with harsh working conditions and limited civil liberties, created fertile ground for Marxist ideology, which promised the overthrow of capitalist exploitation and the rise of worker-led governance. Marxism entered Russia in the late 19th century through intellectual circles in major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. These ideas were adapted to the unique Russian context by figures such as Georgy Plekhanov and later Vladimir Lenin, who argued that a disciplined vanguard party could lead the working class to revolution, even in a country without a fully developed capitalist system. The first major political rupture came in 1905, when a failed revolution sparked by economic crisis and the Russo-Japanese War pushed the Tsarist government to introduce limited reforms like a national parliament. However, these concessions proved insufficient. Revolutionary groups, notably the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, believed that the monarchy was inherently incapable of representing the working class and that a complete overthrow was necessary. World War I became the decisive turning point. Russia's enormous casualties, economic collapse, and widespread famine eroded what little legitimacy the monarchy retained. In early 1917, mass protests in Petrograd led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. A provisional government took power. But its decision to continue the war proved deeply unpopular among soldiers and workers. The Bolsheviks capitalized on public discontent with slogans like peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Soviets' councils of workers and soldiers emerged across the country, becoming alternative centers of authority. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks launched a planned uprising, seizing key facilities in Petrograd and overthrowing the provisional government. This marked the origin of the world's first communist state. After taking power, the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks and began restructuring the state around Marxist-Leninist ideals. They abolished private ownership of land, nationalized banks and heavy industries, and placed railroads, factories, and foreign trade under government control. They also withdrew Russia from World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. However, the road to establishing a communist society was not smooth. Immediately after the revolution, Russia descended into a brutal civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Armies, which were supported by several foreign powers. This conflict lasted from 1918 to 1921 and devastated the nation, leaving millions dead and the economy in ruins. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks implemented an extreme policy known as war communism, which included forced grain requisitioning, nationalization of all industries, and centralized distribution of supplies. While intended to support the war effort, it created widespread famine and resentment, especially among peasants and ethnic minorities. After the Civil War, Lenin recognized the need to ease restrictions. In 1921, he introduced the new economic policy NEP, which reintroduced limited private trade and small-scale capitalism. The NEP was a pragmatic attempt to stabilize the economy. While keeping political power firmly in the hands of the Communist Party, many historians note that this period represented the closest the Soviet Union ever came to a mixed socialist economy. The formal creation of the USSR in 1922 marked the consolidation of the first communist country into a multinational union composed initially of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics. The new state envisioned itself as the vanguard of a worldwide communist movement, hoping other revolutions in Europe would soon follow. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin rose to power and dramatically altered the nature of Soviet communism, abandoned the NEP, and launched rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin built an authoritarian state in which political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed through purges, secret police, and labor camps. These developments marked an important divergence from Marxist theory, which envisioned a stateless, classless society. Instead, the Soviet Union under Stalin became a highly centralized and militarized regime. The state, far from withering away as Marx predicted, became an all-powerful institution controlling nearly every aspect of public and private life. Despite its oppressive characteristics, the USSR achieved extraordinary industrial growth. In less than 2 decades, it transformed from an agrarian empire into a major industrial power capable of defeating Nazi Germany. This success attracted admiration from some developing countries seeking rapid modernization. Following World War II, Soviet models spread across Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. Nations like China, North Korea, Vietnam, and later Cuba adopted versions of communism, though often adapted to their own historical contexts. This global spread created the Cold War's ideological bipolarity. With capitalist and communist blocs locked in political, economic, and military competition, modern communist countries differ significantly from the original Soviet model. For example, China, though ruled by the Communist Party, practices what it calls socialism with Chinese characteristics, which incorporates large-scale market economics, foreign investment, and private enterprise. This hybrid system has led to China becoming the world's second-largest economy. Similarly, Vietnam adopted economic reforms known as GMGI in 1986, introducing market-driven policies while maintaining one-party rule. These reforms boosted economic growth and helped transition Vietnam into a global manufacturing force. In contrast, the Soviet Union often resisted such reforms until its final years. The first communist country, the USSR, aimed for rapid abolition of private property. Modern communist nations are more pragmatic, allowing various degrees of private ownership, especially in agriculture, services, and light industry. This flexibility has generated higher living standards than those experienced in the early Soviet state. Early Soviet communism was heavily focused on the inevitability of world revolution and the exportation of communism abroad. Modern communist countries tend to focus more on national development, stability, and economic growth than on revolutionary expansion. The Soviet Union operated under strict centralized planning, famously through 5-year plans. Modern communist economies like China use long-term planning too, but with far more reliance on market mechanisms, competition, and global trade. This makes today's communist states deeply integrated in the world economy in ways that the USSR never was. Politically, the early Soviet Union maintained a strict hierarchy within the Communist Party, but it allowed certain internal debates, especially during Lenin's leadership. Under Stalin, however, this openness disappeared. Modern communist parties, while still authoritarian, often allow controlled internal discourse to prevent instability and policy stagnation. Culturally, the Soviet Union promoted a unified Soviet identity and used art, literature, and education as propaganda tools. Many modern communist countries have shifted toward cultural nationalism, emphasizing historical identity and social harmony rather than pursuing a unified international communist culture. Economically, the USSR largely isolated itself from global capitalist markets. Relying on internal production and trade within the communist bloc, today's communist states engage in globalized trade, attract foreign investment, participate in multinational corporations, an unthinkable scenario for early Bolshevik leaders. Another major difference concerns technological innovation. The Soviet Union focused heavily on military, aerospace, and heavy industrial technology. Modern communist countries, especially China, focus on consumer technology, digital infrastructure, AI, and electric vehicles sectors that directly influence global markets. Environmental policy also marks a contrast. Early Soviet development prioritized industrial output at all costs, often causing severe ecological damage. Modern communist countries, although still industrially intensive, have adopted more complex environmental strategies, acknowledging climate change and pursuing renewable energy initiatives. In terms of governance, the Soviet Union maintained a rigid command structure with virtually no space for private civic organizations. Contemporary communist states often permit regulated social groups, NGOs, and limited religious practice, though still under close state supervision. Internationally, the Soviet Union saw itself as the leader of a global socialist camp. Modern communist countries, particularly China and Vietnam, seek global influence primarily through economic partnerships, trade agreements, and diplomatic networks, rather than ideological export. Economically speaking, the USSR's collectivized agriculture struggled for decades, leading to chronic shortages. Modern communist countries have seen far more success by allowing private farming, market pricing, and foreign agribusiness partnerships, which have dramatically increased productivity and food security. One of the most profound differences lies in the perception of communism itself. The first communist country was viewed with immense fear and suspicion by Western powers, contributing to the Cold War. Modern communist states, while still politically different, are often treated less as ideological threats and more as strategic competitors or trade partners. In summary, the world's first communist country, the Soviet Union, was born from revolution, war, economic collapse, and a desire to radically remake society. Its early history was defined by ideological purity, centralized control, and sweeping transformation. Modern communist states have evolved in more pragmatic directions, blending market economics with one-party rule. Pursuing national development over global revolution and integrating deeply into the international system, the contrast between the early Soviet experiment and today's communist governments reflects both historical lessons learned and the changing realities of global politics.